Welcome to a world where the frost bites harder, the nights grow longer, and the shadows bring more than just the cold. Tonight we delve into 3 chilling tales of winter terror, from a doomed subway ride through the icy underground to a moonlit massacre among bootleggers deep in the frozen woods, and finally a bonfire gathering where the flames reveal a horrifying truth. These stories will make your blood run cold. So, grab a blanket, turn down the lights, and prepare for the chills. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Dr. Sinister's Tales of Terror, if you dare. I always hated the subway in winter. The cold air followed you underground, turning the steel cars into ice boxes that reeked of wet coats and old cigarettes. But tonight, the cold was the least of my worries. It started like any other late-night commute. The train rattled through the tunnels, half empty but alive with the usual mix of tired faces and unspoken tension. I was sitting near the middle of the car, headphones in, eyes on my phone, trying to tune out the world. That's when I noticed him. The guy looked bad, like he'd just crawled out of a hospital bed. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes had this hollow, glassy look that made my stomach turn. He was sweating too, big drops running down his face even though it was freezing in the car. He sat hunched over, clutching his stomach, and every few seconds he let out this low, wet cough that made people glance his way and edge further down the bench. I told myself to ignore him. Just some sick guy trying to get home, I thought. But something about him wasn't right. The way he kept looking at his hands, flexing his fingers like he didn't recognize them. The way his breath hitched, like he was holding back a scream. And then there was the sound, a deep rumbling growl that I swear came from his chest. The train lurched, the lights flickering as we entered a tunnel. That's when it started. The man let out a low, guttural noise, doubling over in his seat. His back arched, and his body shook like he was having a seizure. People started to notice, pulling out their phones, muttering to each other. A woman across from him stood up, hesitant. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. His breathing grew louder, raspier, until it filled the car, drowning out the clatter of the train. I pulled out my earbuds, my heart pounding as he lifted his head. His eyes weren't hollow anymore. They burned, bright, yellow, and animalistic. They scanned the car, locking onto the woman who'd spoken. His lips curled back, revealing teeth that were too long, too sharp, glinting under the flickering lights. "Sir?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. He lunged. Chaos erupted. The woman screamed as he slammed into her, his teeth sinking into her neck. Blood sprayed across the car, painting the windows and the faces of the stunned passengers. People scrambled to get away, pressing themselves against the doors, but there was nowhere to go. The train was still moving, trapped in the tunnel, and the man, no, the creature, was inhumanly fast. I froze, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. His skin rippled, tearing as thick black fur erupted from his body. His fingers stretched, nails curling into claws that raked through flesh like paper. The woman fell to the floor, her screams gurgling into silence, and the creature turned its glowing eyes to the rest of us. That's when the real killing began. It was a slaughter. He moved through the car like a whirlwind, claws slashing, teeth tearing, the screams of the dying bouncing off the steel walls. I ducked low, crawling under the seats as blood pooled around me, the metallic smell filling my nose. People ran, shoved, begged for mercy, but it didn't matter. He was relentless. That's when I saw her, a woman near the back of the car, crouched like me, her wide eyes locked on mine. She gestured frantically, pointing toward the emergency door between cars. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak, and started crawling toward her. The creature's growls filled the car, louder now, angrier. It wasn't just killing, it was hunting. We reached the emergency door just as the lights flickered again. The creature turned, its eyes finding us in the dim light. My stomach dropped. It snarled, crouching low, ready to pounce. "Go!" the woman shouted, grabbing the emergency lever. The door hissed open, freezing air rushing in as the tunnel blurred past outside. She climbed through first, her breath clouding in the icy wind, and I followed, my hands trembling as I gripped the edges of the doorway. The creature roared, lunging for us, but the train jerked just then, throwing it off balance. It slammed into the wall, claws scraping against metal, and we scrambled onto the narrow platform between cars. The woman slammed the door behind us, and for a moment, there was silence. Then the door shuddered. The creature was trying to break through. We didn't wait to see if it could. We ran, crossing to the next car and pulling the door closed behind us. This one was empty, eerily quiet, but we knew it wouldn't stay that way. The train was slowing, the station ahead coming into view. If we could make it there, maybe, just maybe, we could escape. "Do you think it can get out?" she asked, her voice shaking. I didn't answer. I didn't know. All I knew was that we had to move. The train screeched to a halt, the doors sliding open. We bolted, the cold air biting at our faces as we hit the platform running. Behind us, the creature's roar echoed through the tunnels, followed by the screams of the next car. We didn't stop. We didn't look back. The platform was eerily quiet, as if the air itself held its breath. My boots echoed against the tiles as we sprinted toward the nearest exit, the woman just ahead of me. Her dark hair whipped around her face, and her breaths came in ragged gasps. But she didn't slow down. Neither did I. Behind us, the sound of tearing metal and glass rang out as the creature smashed through the subway car's doors. A guttural snarl followed, growing louder with each second. It was chasing us. "Keep running," I yelled, though I wasn't sure she needed the encouragement. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they might burst, but fear pushed me forward. We reached the stairs, the faint glow of the streetlights above, pulling us like a lifeline. I could feel the vibrations in the ground now, the creature's massive weight, pounding against the tiles as it closed the distance. Its growls echoed off the walls, mingling with the sound of its claws scraping the floor. The woman stumbled, and my heart nearly stopped. I grabbed her arm, hauling her up before she could fall completely. "Don't stop," I shouted, my voice cracking. She nodded, her eyes wide with terror, and we pushed up the stairs together. We burst onto the street, the icy air hitting us like a wall. The city was quiet, the snowfall muffling the world, but the emptiness felt wrong. Where were the taxis, the late-night workers, the drunks stumbling home? It was like the storm had chased everyone inside, leaving the streets abandoned. The woman grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice trembling. I scanned the street, my mind racing. The station behind us still echoed with the creature's roars, the sound growing louder as it neared the surface. My eyes landed on a narrow alley across the street. It wasn't much, but it was dark, and it might give us a chance to hide. "There," I said, pointing. "Go." We dashed across the street, our feet sliding on the slick pavement. The alley was cramped, lined with dumpsters and fire escapes, but it was enough to buy us a few seconds. We ducked behind a dumpster, pressing ourselves against the cold, wet brick wall. The sound of the creature's growls filled the street now, closer than ever. I risked a glance around the corner and saw it emerge from the subway station. Its massive frame stood out against the snow, fur glistening in the dim streetlights. Blood dripped from its claws, staining the snow in dark streaks as it sniffed the air. I held my breath, willing myself to be invisible. The creature prowled down the street, its glowing eyes scanning the darkness. It stopped, tilting its head, and sniffed again. My heart hammered as it turned in our direction. The woman beside me squeezed my arm, her breath hitching, but we didn't move. Then the creature let out a snarl and charged. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the fire escape. The metal ladder was slick with ice, but I scrambled up, dragging her with me. The creature slammed into the dumpster, sending it skidding across the alley with a deafening crash. We climbed higher, the fire escape rattling under our weight. The creature leapt, its claws scraping the metal just below us, but it couldn't quite reach. It roared, shaking the ladder with its massive strength, and I thought for sure it would rip the whole thing down. "Keep going," I yelled, my voice barely audible over the noise. We climbed to the roof, the wind cutting into us as we pulled ourselves onto the flat, snowy surface. The city stretched out before us, silent and indifferent, as if nothing had happened. For a moment, it seemed like we were safe. Then the creature began climbing. Its claws dug into the side of the building, tearing through brick and mortar as it hauled itself upward. It moved faster than anything that size had a right to, and my stomach dropped as I realized we had nowhere else to go. The woman grabbed a loose pipe lying on the roof, her hands shaking. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I looked around, desperate for an answer. My eyes landed on the edge of the roof where the fire escape continued to a neighboring building. It wasn't a great plan, but it was the only one we had. "We jump," I said. Her eyes widened. "Are you insane? Do you have a better idea?" She hesitated for a second, then nodded. The creature's growls grew louder as it neared the top of the building. There was no time to waste. We ran for the edge of the roof, the wind whipping at our faces. I leapt first, the gap between buildings yawning below me. My feet hit the neighboring roof, and I stumbled, rolling to absorb the impact. I turned, holding out my hand as the woman jumped. She grabbed my wrist, and I pulled her up just as the creature appeared on the edge of the roof behind us. It roared, crouching low, preparing to leap. "Go!" I yelled, dragging her toward the next escape route. We didn't look back. The creature didn't hesitate. It leapt across the gap with terrifying ease, landing on the roof behind us with a heavy thud. Its glowing eyes burned into us as it crouched, muscles coiled, ready to pounce. I yanked the woman forward, adrenaline drowning out the ache in my legs. We ran toward the far edge of the second building. Below was a service alley filled with debris, trash bins, abandoned crates, and the mangled remains of a fire escape that had long since collapsed. The drop was too far, but there was no time to think. "This way," I shouted, pulling her toward a rooftop vent. It was large enough to fit through and led, I hoped, into the building below. I slammed my foot against the grate, the metal groaning before it gave way. The woman climbed in first, her movements frantic but determined. "Come on!" she yelled, reaching back for me. I dove into the vent just as the creature lunged. Its claws scraped against the edge of the vent, and the metal buckled with a screech, but it didn't follow. I didn't stop to wonder why. The vent was dark and cramped, the air thick with the smell of rust and mildew. We crawled as fast as we could, the woman ahead of me kicking debris out of the way. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out every other sound. "Where does this lead?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted. "Anywhere but up there." The vent opened into a storage room. We tumbled out onto the concrete floor, the cold seeping through my jacket. Shelves of cleaning supplies and broken furniture lined the walls, and a single flickering bulb cast long shadows across the room. For a moment, we just sat there, gasping for breath. The silence felt heavy, but it wasn't comforting. It was the kind of silence that came before something terrible. Then we heard it, a crash from above, followed by a growl so deep it rattled the shelves. The creature wasn't done. It was coming for us. "Move," I shouted, pulling her to her feet. We burst through the door into a narrow hallway, our footsteps echoing off the walls. The building was old, the kind of place that had been abandoned for years but still stood stubbornly against time. We turned a corner, then another, until we found a stairwell. It spiraled down into darkness, the steps slick with ice and debris. We didn't hesitate. Down was the only direction that made sense. The growls grew louder as we descended, the creature tearing through walls and vents above us. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they might give out, but we didn't stop. Not until we reached the bottom. The stairwell emptied into an underground loading dock. A row of rusted trucks sat in the dim light, their windows fogged with grime. I scanned the room, desperate for an exit. There, a roll-up garage door, half open, leading into the alley. "Go!" I shouted, pushing her toward it. We scrambled under the door, the cold air biting at my face as we emerged into the alley. The snow was falling harder now, turning the world into a blurred, frozen wasteland. But it wasn't enough to hide the sound of the creature's roars as it reached the bottom of the stairwell. I grabbed a length of rebar lying in the snow and turned to face the loading dock. "Keep running," I told her. "What about you?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I'll hold it off." Her eyes searched mine, and for a moment I thought she might argue. But then she nodded, her lips trembling, and took off down the alley. The creature emerged from the loading dock, its massive frame silhouetted against the dim light. Blood matted its fur, and its glowing eyes locked onto me with a predatory intensity that made my stomach churn. It snarled, stepping into the alley, and I raised the rebar, gripping it tightly even though I knew it wouldn't be enough. "Come on, you bastard," I muttered. It charged. The force of the impact knocked me back, the rebar flying from my hands as I hit the ground. Claws raked across my chest, tearing through my jacket and into my skin. Pain exploded in my body, but adrenaline kept me moving. I kicked out, catching it in the jaw, and scrambled to my feet. It roared, lunging for me again, but I was ready this time. I ducked, grabbing a chunk of broken concrete from the ground, and swung it with everything I had. The blow caught it in the side of the head, and it staggered, giving me just enough time to run. I sprinted down the alley, blood dripping from my wounds, and found the woman waiting at the corner. She helped me to my feet, her arm around my shoulders as we stumbled into the night. The creature's growls faded behind us, swallowed by the wind and snow. We didn't stop until we reached a crowded diner. The warmth and noise a stark contrast to the nightmare we'd escaped. We collapsed into a booth, shaking and silent, the other patrons giving us wary glances but saying nothing. "We made it," she whispered, her voice hollow. "I don't know." I groaned, my chest burning and my vision blurring. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The creature's claws had cut deep, and the blood dripping from my wounds felt wrong, hot, thick, and too dark. The cold doesn't kill monsters. It makes them. People always said the woods knew things. I used to think they meant the way shadows played tricks on your eyes, or how the wind carried whispers through the pines. After that night, I know better. The woods don't just know, they judge. It was late, the kind of dark that smothers sound and hides shapes. The fire at the still burned low, casting just enough light to keep the trees at bay. Clyde, Tommy, Big Red, and me were sitting around it, sipping from mason jars filled with the finest batch we'd ever made. The air smelled of oak and yeast, heavy with the promise of payday. Tommy was mid-story, going on about how he'd outrun a sheriff last week when the first howl cut through the night. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Just one long, mournful cry that made the hair on my neck stand up. Clyde chuckled nervously. "Coyote," he said, waving it off, but his hand drifted toward the shotgun, leaning against a barrel, fingers brushing the stock like a habit. Tommy tried to laugh, too. "Ain't no coyote gonna mess with us out here." Big Red grinned wide, raising his jar. "Ain't nothing out here scarier than me," he bellowed. "Now shut up and drink." We all drank, but the air had changed. The woods, so alive with cricket chirps and rustling leaves just minutes ago, had gone silent. It was the kind of quiet that pressed on your ears, made you aware of your own heartbeat. The second hole came. Closer this time, deeper. A rumble under the sound that made it hard to breathe. Clyde stood up, shotgun in hand, squinting into the dark. "Whatever it is, it don't sound friendly," he said. Big Red rolled his eyes, reaching for the shotgun Clyde wasn't holding. "You all jumpy over nothing?" he said. "Probably just a stray dog looking for scraps." But then came the sound, the crunch of leaves, the snap of a branch. Heavy footsteps, deliberate and slow. Whatever it wasn't trying to hide. Tommy froze, his jar halfway to his mouth. "You hear that?" he whispered. We all heard it. The fire popped, and that's when I saw them. Eyes. 2 glowing yellow eyes, staring at us from just beyond the firelight. They didn't blink, didn't move, just watched. "Jesus," Clyde breathed. His hands were steady, but his voice wasn't. Big Red stood, puffing out his chest. "I'll scare it off," he said, taking a step toward the edge of the light. "Ain't no beast alive." Before he could finish, it stepped forward. The firelight caught it, and my stomach dropped. It was massive, covered in mangy black fur that clung to its body like shadow. Its head was too big for its neck, its mouth filled with teeth that gleamed wetly, and its hands, not paws, ended in claws that could carve through a tree. Big Red froze, the shotgun slipping from his hand. The creature tilted its head like it was curious, and then it moved, fast, too fast for something that size. Red didn't even scream, just a sharp, wet sound, and a spray of red that caught the firelight before he hit the ground. Clyde shouted something, and the shotgun roared. The blast hit the creature square in the chest, but it barely flinched. Clyde pumped the gun again, firing into the dark as Tommy and I bolted. We didn't talk, didn't look back. The still toppled behind us, spilling flames and moonshine, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was getting to the truck. "Keys," Tommy gasped, but I was already fumbling for them, my hands shaking so bad I could barely feel the cold metal. They slipped, hitting the dirt with a faint clink. That's when I heard it again. The growl, low, guttural, so close I could feel it in my chest. I turned, slowly, praying I wouldn't see what I knew was there. The eyes met mine. For a moment, I froze. Those yellow eyes locked on mine, unblinking. Time stretched thin, and every sound, the crackling fire, the wind in the trees, even my own ragged breathing, seemed to fade into nothing. All I could hear was the low, guttural growl rolling out of its throat, vibrating through my chest like thunder. Then it moved. The creature lunged toward me, its claws glinting in the faint light. I didn't think. I just dove to the side, hitting the dirt hard as it barreled past, skidding to a halt with terrifying grace. It turned, slower now, savoring the moment. I scrambled backward, my hands digging into the damp earth until they brushed against the keys I'd dropped. The truck, my only chance. "Tommy!" I shouted, my voice cracking. But Tommy wasn't there. I didn't know where he'd gone, didn't hear him running anymore, just the ragged sound of my own breath and the low rumble of that thing's growl. It came for me again, slower this time, like it was playing with its food. My fingers closed around the keys, and I pushed myself up, my legs burning as I ran for the truck. I could feel it behind me, every step a tremor in the ground, closing the distance faster than I could hope to outrun. I reached the driver's side door and yanked it open, throwing myself inside just as the creature's claws raked across the metal. The screech was deafening, a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my days. I shoved the keys into the ignition, my hands shaking so bad it took 3 tries to get them to turn. The engine roared to life, and for a second, I thought I might actually make it. Then the truck lurched, the whole frame shaking as the creature landed on the hood. Its claws dug into the metal, its eyes blazing through the windshield. It snarled, and I could see the saliva dripping from its teeth, its breath fogging up the glass between us. I slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The truck lurched forward, throwing me against the seat as it careened through the trees. The creature held on, its claws ripping deep gouges into the hood. I swerved hard, aiming for a low-hanging branch. The impact was sickening, a wet crunch as the branch connected with the thing's side, tearing it off the truck. It hit the ground and rolled, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't stop. Didn't even think about stopping. The truck roared down the dirt path, branches clawing at the sides like skeletal hands. I drove faster than I ever had, my heart hammering in my chest, until the trees began to thin, and the faint glow of the main road came into view. I didn't stop until I was miles away, parked on the side of the highway, my hands gripping the wheels so tight my knuckles turned white. The truck was a mess, deep gouges in the hood, the windshield cracked, and blood smeared across the front. My blood? Its blood? I didn't know and I didn't care. I just sat there, staring at the road ahead, trying to catch my breath. Tommy, Clyde, Big Red, they were gone. I knew it. The still was gone, too, burned to ash with whatever was left of our batch. All of it erased in a single night. And the creature? I don't know. Maybe it's dead. Maybe it's out there, waiting for the next poor soul who stumbles too deep into those woods. All I know is I won't go back. Not ever. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls just right, I hear it. A low, mournful cry, far off in the distance, and I wonder if it's calling for me. The fire crackled and popped, sparks shooting into the dark winter sky. The air was bitterly cold, but the flames and the whiskey warmed us enough to make it bearable. Snow blanketed the forest around us, the trees tall and skeletal against the glow of the bonfire. It was the perfect setting for a weekend escape. A rented cabin, a stash of booze, and the promise of stories to keep us entertained. There were 6 of us. Me, my girlfriend Leah, her best friend Emma, Emma's boyfriend Tom, and the twins, Jake and Julie. We'd driven up that afternoon, hauling groceries, blankets, and firewood into the cabin before lighting the bonfire just as the sun dipped behind the hills. "All right," Jake said, tipping back his flask and grinning. "Who's got a scary story? Let's make this night memorable." Emma rolled her eyes. "Scary stories? What are we, 12? "Come on, it's tradition," Jake said, gesturing at the flames. "You don't waste a bonfire without telling at least one." Leah laughed, leaning into me. "I've got one," she said, "but it's going to keep you up all night." "That's the point," I said, smiling as she launched into her tale about a haunted ski lodge. It wasn't half bad, though Tom and Jake spent most of it cracking jokes. By the time she finished, we were all laughing, except Julie, who glanced nervously into the trees. "That's enough," Julie muttered. "Let's talk about something else." "Oh, come on, Jules," Jake teased. "You can't really be scared." Before she could answer, a voice cut through the laughter. "Evening, folks." We all froze, turning toward the sound. Standing at the edge of the firelight was an old man, bundled in a thick coat with a fur-lined hood. His face was weathered, his gray beard dusted with frost, and he leaned heavily on a walking stick. "Sorry if I startled you," he said, his voice gravelly but calm. "Saw your fire and thought I'd say hello." Tom was the first to speak. "Hey, can we help you?" The man chuckled, stepping closer. "Just passing through. Don't get much company up here. Thought I'd warm my bones for a spell." We exchanged uneasy glances. Strangers weren't exactly part of the plan, but the guy didn't look threatening, just old and tired. "Sure," Leah said finally. "Have a seat." The man lowered himself onto a log near the fire, his movements slow and deliberate. He pulled a flask from his coat, tipping it toward us. "Cheers," he said, taking a long drink. "You kids got yourselves a fine fire here." "Thanks," Jake said, still wary. "What brings you out this way?" "Just wandering," the man said, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "Been wandering for years." We settled back into our conversation, though the mood had shifted. The man didn't say much, just watched us with a faint smile, listening as Jake told a half-baked ghost story, and Julie tried to laugh off her earlier nerves. Eventually, Tom turned to the old man. "You must have heard some good stories in your time," he said. "You got one for us?" The man's smile widened. "I might," he said, his voice soft, "though it's not the kind of story you'd want to hear out here." "That's exactly the kind of story we want to hear," Jake said, grinning. "Hit us with your best shot, old man." The man leaned forward, his face lit by the fire. "All right then," he said, "but don't say I didn't warn you." He began to speak, his voice low and steady, and the air around the fire seemed to grow colder. "There was a group, not unlike yourselves," he said, "who came to these woods one winter, looking for a good time. They lit a fire, drank their drinks, and told their stories. And then, just as the night was getting good, a stranger wandered into their camp, an old man, much like me." The fire crackled, and we all leaned closer, the unease palpable. "The stranger warned them," the man continued, "told them they should leave, said there was a full moon that night, and that he wasn't himself under the full moon, that he'd change, that he'd kill Julie, shifted uncomfortably." "This isn't funny," she muttered. But the man went on, his voice unwavering. They didn't believe him, of course. Laughed it off, told him to leave. So he did. But later that night, when the moon rose high and the fire began to die, he came back. Not as a man, but as a beast, and he killed them. Every last one. The silence that followed was unbearable. The man leaned back, his eyes flicking to each of us. "Funny how history repeats itself," he said. Tom broke the tension with an awkward laugh. "Okay, good one," he said, clapping his hands. "But seriously, maybe you should be heading out." The old man nodded, rising slowly. "Maybe I should," he said. "Y'all take care now. Enjoy your night." He walked away, disappearing into the shadows as easily as he'd appeared. We sat in silence for a moment, the fire popping and hissing, before Jake finally spoke. "Well, that was creepy as hell." Julie hugged her knees to her chest, her eyes darting toward the trees. "We shouldn't have let him stay. He's just some old guy." Leah said, though her voice lacked conviction. He's gone now. But he wasn't gone. Not really. The fire burned lower, and the conversation dwindled as unease settled over the group. We were all thinking the same thing, though no one wanted to say it out loud. There was something off about that old man. Julie broke the silence. "We should go inside," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No way," Jake said, trying to sound brave. "We're fine out here. He's probably miles away by now." But even as he said it, we all glanced toward the woods. The shadows felt deeper, the air colder. The full moon, now high in the sky, cast a pale glow over the clearing, making everything feel sharper and more unreal. Then we heard it, a low, guttural growl, faint but unmistakable. It carried through the night like a predator's warning, freezing the blood in my veins. "What the hell was that?" Tom whispered, his eyes wide. The growl came again, louder this time, and closer. The sound seemed to echo from all around us, bouncing off the trees. I grabbed Leah's hand, my pulse racing. "Inside, now," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. We scrambled to our feet, the bonfire forgotten as we ran toward the cabin. The door slammed shut behind us and Tom threw the lock, his hands shaking. "What do we do?" Emma asked, her voice breaking. "Do we call someone?" "Who, the cops?" Jake snapped. "What do we even tell them? That some creepy old guy told a scary story and now we're scared." "Shut up, Jake," Julie hissed, tears streaming down her face. Before anyone could answer, the growl came again, this time right outside the cabin. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, and then something heavy slammed against the door. We all jumped, staring at the door as it shuddered under the impact. "Oh my God," Leah whispered, clutching my arm. Another slam, harder this time. The door creaked, the wood splintering under the force. Whatever was outside was massive, and it wasn't stopping. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. "To where?" Tom shot back. "It's out there." The answer came with a crash. The door exploded inward, sending shards of wood flying. And there it stood, crouched in the doorway, its massive frame blocking out the night. The creature was monstrous. Thick matted fur covered its hunched body, and its glowing yellow eyes scanned the room with terrifying intelligence. Its claws, long and curved, glinted in the moonlight, and its breath came in short, steaming bursts, each exhale carrying the scent of blood and decay. It was the old man. There was no doubt in my mind. His warning hadn't been a joke. His story hadn't been just a story. He'd told us exactly what was coming, and now it was here. Julie screamed, bolting toward the back door, but the creature moved faster than anything that size should have been able to. It leapt across the room, slashing her down with a single swipe. Blood sprayed across the walls, and she crumpled to the floor. "Go, run!" I shouted, grabbing Leah's hand and pulling her toward the kitchen. Tom and Emma followed, but the creature was right behind us. It slammed into the table, sending it flying, and pinned Tom to the floor. He screamed as its jaws closed around his throat, cutting off the sound in a wet, gurgling crunch. Emma froze, paralyzed with terror, and I had to drag Leah away from the sight. "Come on," I shouted, pushing her toward the back door. We burst outside into the freezing night, the snow crunching under our feet as we ran blindly into the woods. The cold air burned my lungs, and my legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. Behind us, I could hear the creature crashing through the trees, its snarls echoing in the dark. It was toying with us, I realized. It didn't just want to kill us. It wanted to chase us first. "Over here," Leah cried, pointing toward a cluster of fallen trees. We dove behind them, pressing ourselves into the snow and holding our breath. The creature stalked past, its massive frame barely visible in the moonlight. I could see its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air, searching for us. For a moment it paused, its glowing eyes scanning the woods. My heart pounded so hard, I was sure it could hear it. Then finally, it turned and loped off into the distance. We didn't move for what felt like an eternity. When the growls faded completely, I dared to whisper, "We have to go." Leah nodded, her face pale and streaked with tears. We crawled out from behind the trees and began walking, our breaths fogging in the freezing air. The cabin was gone, our friends were gone, and the only thing that mattered now was getting out of those woods alive. By the time we reached the road, the first light of dawn was breaking over the hills. We flagged down a passing truck, and the driver didn't ask any questions when he saw the blood on our clothes and the terror in our eyes. He just drove. We didn't speak until we were miles away. Even then, I couldn't find the words to explain what had happened. I wasn't sure I even believed it myself. But I knew one thing for certain. We should have listened to the old man. The cold doesn't just bring the monsters, it makes you their prey.